I want you to put yourself in the shoes of a military planner for just a second.
Okay.
You are sitting at the helm of the most powerful, technologically advanced, and frankly, absurdly well-funded military apparatus in human history.
Right.
And you're looking at the board, and you launch this massive, highly coordinated operation. I mean, over the course of just 5 days, you pull off what looks, on paper anyway, like an absolute masterclass in conventional warfare.
A flawless execution.
Exactly, a 100% success rate. You neutralize every single target on your operational list. You sink every enemy naval vessel in the theater.
Yeah.
You systematically dismantle their radar networks, their nuclear research facilities, their regional command hubs. The enemy's conventional military capacity isn't just degraded, it is, well, it's mathematically shredded.
By every traditional metric taught at the war colleges, you have achieved total decisive victory.
Right. And yet somehow, despite executing the playbook perfectly, despite winning every single tactical engagement, you completely and utterly lose the war.
It sounds like a total breakdown of logic, honestly. Because the fundamental equation of global conflict since, the Industrial Revolutions are pretty straightforward. You degrade the enemy's capacity to field a force, you establish kinetic dominance, and you win.
You dictate the terms.
Exactly. You dictate the terms. But what we're unpacking today is the absolute collapse of that equation.
We are looking at a highly consequential sequence of events from February 2026, which is a massive United States military operation against Iran. And our mission for this deep dive today is to really dig into the glaring, almost invisible gap between overwhelming conventional superiority and actual on-the-ground strategic control.
Because the fascinating question, how do you run the table on the battlefield but lose the reality on the ground?
Exactly. But before we rip the lid off the tactical timeline, let's level set with you, the listener, about how we are approaching this. The source material we're digging into involves active geopolitical fault lines, major global powers, real-world leaders, and, significant casualties.
Which means we really need to clearly define our parameters here. We are analyzing this purely through the lens of systems analysis and strategic mechanics.
Right.
We aren't here to validate any military doctrines or endorse any political viewpoints or justify the actions or retaliations of any party involved, not the left, not the right, or anywhere on the geopolitical spectrum.
Our role is strictly to impartially report and analyze the contents of these sources. We are simply mapping the physics of this specific conflict as they're laid out in the documentation.
Right. We're looking at the chessboard, observing how the pieces move, and decoding how these massive global mechanisms interact, often with catastrophic unintended consequences.
Okay, let's unpack this, because I am just fascinated by how the established rules of global power projection, the assumptions that have governed international relations for the last 80 years, seem to just evaporate overnight.
They really did.
Let's start with the sheer scale of the initial operation. February 2026. The operation picks off with 900 individual airstrikes across Iranian territory in a 5-day window. That is an almost incomprehensible density of ordnance.
It is a display of absolute, unadulterated kinetic force designed to just overwhelm any possible defensive capability.
Yeah.
I mean, the Iranian Air Force was effectively dismantled on the tarmacs.
Right, before they could even get in the air.
Exactly. The Navy suffered catastrophic losses. We're talking 30 warships sent to the bottom of the Gulf within that 5-day window. Anti-air batteries, ballistic missile silos, nuclear enrichment sites, command and control infrastructure, all gone.
So the Pentagon's post-operation assessment was textbook. Decisive military superiority achieved across all operational domains.
It was a clean sweep.
And the focal point of this entire campaign, the absolute tip of the spear, occurred on a specific morning. At 6:45 a.m., a coordinated wave of Israeli jets penetrated the airspace over Tehran and struck the Supreme Leader's compound.
A highly targeted strike.
Right, and the strike killed the 86-year-old leader along with his family, his daughter, his son-in-law, his grandchildren. And the Pentagon, reading from their established playbook, confidently labeled this a successful decapitation.
And, the psychology of that specific word, decapitation, it reveals so much about the blind spots in modern military planning.
How so?
Well, it relies on a biological metaphor. You treat a nation-state like a centralized nervous system. You sever the head, the brain stops sending signals, and the body immediately dies.
Right.
This is the doctrine that really crystallized during the 1990s and 2000s. It worked to varying degrees on Saddam Hussein in Iraq and with high-value targets in counterterrorism operations. So the institutional assumption became that this is an immutable law of physics in warfare.
You remove the autocratic leader, the regime splinters, a power vacuum opens, the populace rises up to fill it, and you achieve regime change without a prolonged ground invasion.
Exactly. That was the assumed reality.
But let me stop you right there, because applying a 1990s secular autocratic playbook to a deeply entrenched theological system seems like a staggering miscalculation.
It's a massive oversight.
And the fatal piece of context that the planners completely whiffed on or willfully ignored in their modeling makes this even more baffling. The supreme leader wasn't just a political figurehead. He was 86 years old, and he had been battling advanced prostate cancer for years.
And this is where the intelligence failure pivots from a failure of collection to a massive failure of interpretation. He had explicit forewarning. The intelligence indicated he knew the strike was imminent.
Wait, he knew. He had the window of time to evacuate to a hardened subterranean bunker, and he explicitly refused.
Yeah, he chose to stay.
He sat at his desk in Tehran, surrounded by his family, fully prepared to absorb a direct strike. He wasn't caught off guard at all. He was actively waiting for it.
Because he understood the cultural and religious framework he operated within far better than the Pentagon planners did. In the context of Shia Islam, and specifically the ideological foundation of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, being killed by your primary geopolitical adversary isn't viewed as a systemic defeat.
It's not a loss.
No, it is the ultimate ideological victory. It is martyrdom.
I really have to wrestle with the logic of the military planners here. I mean, if you are fighting an adversary whose entire theological architecture rewards martyrdom, whose defining historical narratives are built around leaders sacrificing themselves against overwhelming odds, why would you deliver the exact validation they crave?
It defies logic.
You are handing them their foundational myth on a silver platter. It feels like trying to extinguish a grease fire by throwing a bucket of water on it. You apply a standard, everyday solution to a highly volatile, specific chemical problem, and all you do is superheat the water into steam and cause the burning oil to explode in your face.
That is precisely the mechanism of failure here. They applied the physics of water to a chemical fire. A kinetic strike is a structural solution aimed at removing a command node. But in an ideological system, the spectacular removal of that node acts as a massive psychological accelerant.
It makes it worse.
Much worse. Martyrdom doesn't extinguish these movements. It instantly sanctifies them. It essentially removes any domestic political opposition to their retaliation.
And the ignition of that accelerant was immediate, because killing the leader didn't trigger a regime collapse at all. It triggered a structural metamorphosis. The military's DNA fundamentally changed overnight.
Right. The United States military had spent decades mapping the Iranian chain of command. They treated it exactly like a centralized nervous system. They identified exactly who reports to whom, where the communications arrays are located, and how orders flow from Tehran down through the regional commanders.
Because the U.S. excels at finding centralized nodes and dropping precision munitions on them.
They're the best in the world at it.
So the U.S. effectively destroyed the central nervous system.
They did. But within 48 hours of those strikes, the Iranian military intentionally leaned into that destruction and completely decentralized. That entire hierarchical nervous system simply vanished.
Just poof, gone.
Gone. The centralized chain of command evaporated, and it was replaced instantaneously by highly autonomous regional cells. Suddenly, every local commander wasn't waiting for orders from Tehran.
They didn't need to.
Exactly. They had pre-authorized standing orders. Every single cell had its own localized logistical caches, its own predetermined target lists, and the unilateral authority to engage.
So the biological metaphor flips entirely. You aren't fighting a snake where you can just chop off the head. You are suddenly fighting a swarm of hornets.
A perfect analogy.
You can swat 10, 20, 50 of them out of the sky, but the swarm as an entity doesn't care. It doesn't rely on a central brain to tell it to keep stinging.
And the American wargaming models historically assume that decentralization equals chaos, friction, and eventual surrender. The assumption is if a unit can't talk to headquarters, it stops fighting.
Right.
But in this doctrine, loss of communication was the actual trigger for radical autonomy. The structural dissolution actually resulted in higher operational efficiency because the U.S. had no high-value centralized targets left to hit. You literally cannot decapitate a swarm.
Which forces us to look at where the U.S. actually did drop all those bombs. We're talking about 900 airstrikes. And a massive proportion of those munitions fell on major urban centers: Tehran, Isfahan, Tabriz.
Yes.
Let's unpack the sociology of that targeting strategy because it is a devastating political irony in the sources.
If the underlying strategic goal of the decapitation strike was to catalyze an internal civilian uprising against the regime, you have to look at the demographics of the cities you are heavily bombarding.
Who actually lives there?
Right. Tehran, Isfahan, Tabriz, these are the economic and cultural hubs. They are home to Iran's most educated, urban, and progressive populations. These are the exact demographics that have historically protested the regime, the very people most culturally primed to push for internal reform or regime change.
So the U.S. military planners wanted a civilian uprising, but instead of empowering the specific demographic that might actually rise up, they spend billions of dollars dropping high explosive precision munitions onto their apartment buildings, their power grids, and their infrastructure.
Exactly. While simultaneously, the most committed ideological hardliners, the deeply religious, highly radicalized factions of the Revolutionary Guard who are willing to fight a generational war regardless of the cost.
Where were they?
They were largely stationed in hardened facilities out in the rural, mountainous regions, virtually untouched by the urban bombardment.
Here's where it gets really interesting. We basically engineered our own worst-case scenario. It's like a surgeon who goes in to cut out a tumor, but their scalpel slips and they accidentally carve out the patient's entire immune system instead.
Wow, yeah.
Leaving the cancer completely untouched and totally free to spread, the U.S. systematically destroyed the lives of its only potential political allies inside the country, and in the process, radically alienated any moderate who might have been sitting on the fence.
You take a populace that might have been quietly sympathetic to your overarching political goals, and through the sheer trauma of bombardment, you convert them into committed generational enemies. It is a failure of basic political logic.
Unbelievable.
And as this newly decentralized, highly motivated, and deeply radicalized force shook off the initial strikes, they didn't waste time trying to rebuild their central bases. They immediately looked outward. They redefined the geography of the battlefield entirely.
Because when we typically conceptualize a war between the U.S. and Iran, we picture the fighting happening strictly within Iranian borders or maybe, spilling over into U.S. forward operating bases in Iraq. But the retaliation wasn't contained to those obvious zones at all. Within days, the swarm struck out at Dubai, Bahrain, Qatar, and Kuwait.
And if you're just a casual observer of global geopolitics, that target list seems irrational. You look at that and ask, why are they hitting those countries? Those are Gulf states that hold press conferences declaring themselves absolutely neutral third parties in this conflict.
Right. They stand at the podium and say, we have nothing to do with this. But the tactical reality completely deconstructs the concept of neutrality. Neutral is a convenient legal fiction for diplomatic cables. It's not for actual kinetic warfare.
The Iranian strategy brilliantly, and I'm using brilliantly in a strictly cold analytical sense here, exposed the invisible architecture of American power projection. These states are not Switzerland. They are the logistical and financial scaffolding of the American military-industrial complex in the Middle East.
They are deeply embedded.
Exactly. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, they physically host massive U.S. military installations. More importantly, they actively opened their sovereign airspace, allowing the waves of U.S. jets to transit through and deliver those 900 strikes on Iranian soil.
I mean, logically, you cannot let a guy stand in your living room to wind up his swing to punch me in the face and then throw your hands up and claim you are just a neutral bystander. It just doesn't work that way.
It doesn't. And the scaffolding goes far deeper than just geography and airspace. It's deeply financial. These Gulf states operate on the petrodollar system. They extract massive amounts of oil, sell it exclusively in U.S. dollars, and then take those staggering dollar reserves and recycle them directly back into the American financial system. They purchase billions in U.S. Treasury bonds, which finances the U.S. government deficit. They pour capital into American tech stocks, venture capital funds, and real estate. They are the financial lifeblood of the very system that just launched a decapitation strike across the Gulf.
So the swarm wasn't lashing out blindly. They were surgically targeting the economic vulnerabilities of that scaffolding. They hit the U.S. Fifth Fleet headquarters in Bahrain. They struck Aramco's Ras Tanura refinery in Saudi Arabia, which is, one of the single most critical oil processing arteries on the planet. And they targeted Dubai International Airport, which is a massive, indispensable global transit and logistics hub.
But the strategic intent wasn't necessarily to reduce these massive facilities to rubble. A drone hitting an airport runway or a refinery pipeline can cause disruption, but concrete can be poured and pipes can be welded. The true genius of targeting these locations was the psychological exposure of their inherent fragility.
This is where the human element becomes so fascinating to me. Let's look at the sociology of Dubai for a second. It is a stunning engineering marvel. You have indoor ski slopes in the desert, man-made archipelagos shaped like palm trees, glass towers piercing the clouds.
It's incredible.
But that entire glittering metropolis is built on one fatal, unspoken assumption: the absolute guarantee of perpetual peace.
It's an environment optimized purely for frictionless global commerce, not for kinetic conflict.
And who actually lives there?
Right.
Roughly 90% of Dubai's population are foreign workers. They are expatriates, ranging from high-level finance executives to construction laborers. They are there on work visas. They are highly financially incentivized to be there, but they do not have deep generational blood and soil loyalty to the land.
Which means the psychological threshold for abandonment is incredibly low.
Right. So Iran didn't actually need to deploy enough ordnance to level the Burj Khalifa to defeat Dubai, did they? They just needed to irrevocably shatter the illusion of safety. They just had to convince a British banker or a software engineer that their tax-free salary wasn't worth the risk of catching shrapnel in their living room.
The moment autonomous drones start penetrating the airspace, interceptors are exploding over luxury hotels, and smoke is rising from the international airport, the entire risk calculus flips. The expats immediately start liquidating assets and booking flights home.
They just bail.
They bail. And when the foreign workforce, which constitutes the entire operational backbone of the city, decides to leave, the city doesn't just slow down. It ceases to function entirely.
These gleaming Gulf cities are essentially luxury cruise ships. They are gorgeous, they have sprawling buffets, they have infinity pools on the top deck. But if you are suddenly informed that your luxury cruise ship is currently navigating through an active, live-fire naval war zone, nobody cares about the buffet anymore.
No, the amenities lose all value.
Exactly. Everyone drops what they're doing and sprints for the lifeboats. The city is structurally fragile the very second the glass breaks.
And exposing the fragility of the expat workforce was merely the localized shockwave. Phase 2 of the economic retaliation involved targeting the most notoriously risk-averse group of people on the planet. And by terrifying this specific group, they managed to fundamentally asphyxiate the global economy.
We are talking about the actuaries.
Yes, the marine insurance actuaries sitting in syndicates in London and New York. Which brings us to the geographical linchpin of global energy, the Strait of Hormuz.
Let's clearly define the physical reality of this choke point, because it really explains the exact mechanism of the economic checkmate. If you look at the topography of the Strait of Hormuz, the problem isn't just that it's a narrow funnel connecting the Persian Gulf to the open ocean. At its narrowest, it is a mere 21 miles wide.
Very narrow.
And through that tiny 21-mile gap, roughly 20% of the world's daily oil supply is forced to transit.
But the critical factor is the elevation. Iran controls the entire northern coastline of that strait, and it is highly mountainous terrain. You have jagged peaks, deep valleys, and complex cave systems that provide natural, fortified high ground.
Right.
The Iranian military can position highly mobile anti-ship missile batteries and drone-launched platforms in those mountains, looking straight down the throat of the shipping lanes, while the Gulf Cooperation Council states to the south are sitting on flat, exposed desert coastlines.
So the high ground inherently belongs to the swarm. On Martyrdom 2nd, the physical closure of the strait wasn't a press release or a symbolic political threat. They locked radar onto commercial vessels attempting transit and began firing. The impact was instantaneous. Commercial tanker traffic plummeted an astonishing 81% in a single week.
The global macroeconomic shockwave was immediate. Brent crude oil blew past the psychological barrier of $100 a barrel and spiked to $126. If you're an energy-independent nation, that hurts. But if you're an energy-dependent economy, it is catastrophic.
Yeah.
Japan imports the vast majority of its oil through Hormuz. India relies on it for roughly 45% of its supply. The Chinese manufacturing engine is deeply tethered to it. When the foundational cost of energy spikes by 30 or 40% overnight, it violently restructures the cost basis of every single supply chain on Earth.
Because you cannot manufacture a microchip, transport a container of grain, or stock a grocery store shelf without burning energy.
Right. But the geopolitical vulnerability of the strait goes both ways, and this is a structural dependency that military strategists often gloss over. We obsess over the oil flowing out of the Gulf to fuel the world. But the Strait of Hormuz isn't just an exit door for energy. For the Gulf states themselves, it is the sole entrance door for basic survival.
It's an inlet. We are talking about nations built in hyper-arid deserts. They cannot grow enough food to feed their populations. They cannot manufacture their own medical supplies or heavy industrial equipment.
Look at it.
Every single calorie of grain, every antibiotic, every replacement part for their water desalination plants, it all has to flow in through that exact same 21-mile choke point.
The American Empire essentially constructed its regional center of gravity in an environment completely incapable of sustaining human life without continuous, massive, uninterrupted maritime logistics. The vulnerability was always sitting right there in plain sight, baked into the geography, just waiting for an adversary who possessed the asymmetrical tools and the political will to exploit it.
And the swarm exploited it brilliantly by triggering what military analysts are calling the actuarial war. They didn't need to physically sink every single grain freighter or oil tanker. By March 5th, the syndicates providing protection and indemnity marine insurance, the legally mandated foundational coverage required for any commercial vessel to operate in international waters, pulled their coverage from the region entirely.
They designated the Gulf an uninsurable war risk zone.
Ex-
And you have to understand how these risk tables work. It's all calculated by actuaries sitting in offices thousands of miles away assessing probability. When the risk of a total hull loss reaches a certain threshold, the standard policies are voided. If a shipping conglomerate desperately wanted to move a cargo and sought specialized war risk coverage, the premiums demanded by the few syndicates willing to write a policy became mathematically absurd.
How absurd.
We're talking about premiums hitting 5% of the ship's total value for a single one-way transit.
So let's do the math on that, because this is wild. If you are operating a massive VLCC, a very large crude carrier, the hull itself is worth upwards of $100 million. 5% of the hull value means you're paying $5 million in pure insurance premiums just across a 21-mile stretch of water.
Exactly.
And that doesn't even factor in the cargo value or the crew liability.
And the profit margins in commercial shipping are notoriously thin. A $5 million premium instantly erases any conceivable profit from the voyage. So the ships simply dropped anchor and refused to enter the strait. They stopped coming.
And that is the crux of the actuarial war. Missiles didn't physically stop global shipping. Accountants did. I like to picture it like trying to drive your car to work. You wake up, your car has a full tank of gas. The physical road to your office is perfectly paved and clear of debris.
Right.
But overnight, your car insurance company emailed you and said, due to increased traffic accidents, your daily premium is now $10,000 a day. It does not matter if the physical road is technically open. The economic reality strictly overrides the physical reality. You mathematically cannot afford to turn the key in the ignition.
Iran achieved absolute economic checkmate without needing to win a single conventional blue water naval engagement.
Yeah.
They didn't need to deploy a fleet of destroyers to challenge the U.S. Fifth Fleet for supremacy of the sea lanes. They just utilized cheap, decentralized platforms to make the mathematical risk of transit completely uninsurable.
Yeah.
And the staggering disparity between the cost of the swarm's weapons and the cost of the United States defense systems is where the entire paradigm of modern warfare completely unravels.
We really need to drill down into the granular mathematics of this asymmetry because it exposes the fundamental structural rot at the core of the U.S. defense apparatus. Let's examine the weaponry imbalance, starting with the primary offensive tool of the swarm, which is the Iranian Shahed 136 drone.
The physical characteristics of the Shahed 136 are almost deceptively primitive. It's a delta-wing munition, roughly 11 feet long. The wingspan is smaller than your average midsize sedan.
Pretty small.
Yeah, and it utilizes a two-stroke engine. Literally the kind of engine you'd find at a loud commercial lawnmower. It flies low, and it flies exceptionally slow, cruising at around 115 miles per hour. It doesn't use complex encrypted military targeting uplinks. It navigates using commercially available standard GPS modules, flies to a predetermined coordinate, goes into a terminal dive, and detonates a modest explosive payload.
It is essentially a flying lawnmower with a pipe bomb strapped to the nose. And the manufacturing cost is the real weapon here. Producing one Shahed costs between $20,000 and $50,000. It is so cheap that Iran was churning out between 200 and 500 of these units every single month.
Every month.
And structurally, they are highly mobile. You don't need a massive, hardened billion-dollar airbase to launch them. You can mount the launch rack on the back of a standard, innocent-looking commercial flatbed truck, pull over on a highway, launch a volley in under 3 minutes, and immediately blend back into normal civilian traffic before any satellite can even register the heat bloom.
Now pivot to the system the United States relies on to defend its bases, its allies, and its critical infrastructure against this threat. the Patriot Missile Air Defense System.
The unit cost of a single Patriot missile interceptor is roughly $4 million.
But the disparity isn't just financial, it's heavily mechanical. The Patriot system is an incredible piece of engineering, but it was designed, optimized, and algorithmically tuned to detect and destroy high-altitude supersonic ballistic missiles or high-performance fighter jets. Its Doppler radar systems are looking for large radar cross-sections moving at incredible speeds.
So when a Shahed drone, which is made of cheap composite materials, has the radar signature of a large bird and is just puttering along just above the tree line at 115 miles per hour, enters the airspace, the Patriot's highly sophisticated algorithms literally struggle to see it. It filters it out as background clutter.
Precisely. The radar is so advanced it literally becomes blind to the primitive. When the system finally does lock on, the targeting geometry for hitting a low, slow target with a hypervelocity interceptor is incredibly complex. Standard military operating procedure often dictates firing 2, sometimes 3, of these $4 million interceptors at a single incoming threat just to guarantee a kill and protect the asset on the ground.
Let's wrestle with that math out loud, because it is apocalyptic for a military budget. To shoot down a single $50,000 drone, the United States is frequently forced to expend 2 Patriot missiles. That is $8 million. You are burning $8 million in highly advanced engineering to destroy $50,000 worth of fiberglass and a 2-stroke engine.
It's completely unsustainable.
Analysts calculate the attrition ratio bluntly in the sources. For every single dollar the swarm spends on offense, the American military is forced to spend between $80 and $200 simply to play defense.
And the financial burn rate is only half the crisis. The more immediate, lethal problem is the industrial production bottleneck. Defense contractors like Lockheed Martin operate on incredibly complex, heavily regulated supply chains. Producing a Patriot missile requires specialized microchips, rare earth materials, and highly trained aerospace technicians. At maximum capacity, the U.S. industrial base could produce approximately 620 Patriot interceptors in an entire year.
Wait, I want to clarify that. 620 interceptors per year.
Per year. While the decentralized swarm infrastructure inside Iran can easily manufacture and deploy 500 drones every single month.
The math is a literal death spiral. It's an unwinnable equation. The swarm can organically build more offensive drones in 30 days than the entire multi-trillion-dollar U.S. defense industrial complex can build defensive interceptors in 365 days. You are going bankrupt trying to swat 1 million gnats with solid gold fly swatters, and worst of all, the factory can only make a few hundred fly swatters a year. You physically run out of ammunition before the enemy runs out of cheap drones.
This profound mismatch forces us to ask why the most heavily funded military on Earth is structured this way. Why is it so structurally inflexible? The strategic analysis points directly to a massive Cold War hangover. The entire architecture of the American military, and more importantly, the defense contracting industry that supplies it, was engineered for an era of great power competition, where the primary goal was nuclear and conventional deterrence.
Right. The logic was you build the most terrifying, unimaginably expensive, over-engineered weapons platforms possible, like the Death Star, specifically so that nobody ever dares to mess with you and you never actually have to fight a hot war.
Deterrence relies on the spectacle of overwhelming capability. But this directly shaped the incentive structure of the defense industry. Under the system of cost-plus contracting and massive lobbying efforts, defense corporations do not generate record shareholder profits by inventing cheap, efficient, asymmetrical solutions. There is absolutely no billionaire-making profit margin in developing a $50,000 drone interceptor.
No, the profit, the massive multi-decade government contracts, the stock buybacks, the ability to lobby Congress by placing manufacturing jobs in key electoral districts, all of that is intrinsically tied to the $4 million Patriot missile. The system incentivizes complexity over utility.
The financial architecture of the military-industrial complex was perfectly aligned to sell the most expensive possible hardware, completely detached from whether that hardware is actually suited for the grimy, decentralized reality of modern asymmetrical warfare.
I want to build on an analogy from the sources that frequently comes up in these tactical postmortems because it perfectly visualizes the vulnerability. The U.S. military is essentially a bodybuilder who has spent 20 years locked inside a highly controlled, air-conditioned gym. They are massive, their muscles are bulging, they have optimized every single pose for the mirrors, they look absolutely terrifying and invincible from a distance,
Right.
but they have never actually been in an unpredictable, chaotic street fight. all that dense muscle mass actually restricts their range of motion. So when they step out into the alley and someone half their size throws a wild asymmetrical punch, the bodybuilder is too rigid, too slow, and too oxygen deprived to react.
And in this scenario, the punch wasn't a single strike. It was a relentless swarm of thousands of cheap, mobile drones that the over-engineered bodybuilder simply didn't have the agility or the stamina to catch.
Which makes me want to push back on the core premise of failure here. Are we looking at a defense system that is fundamentally broken? Or are we looking at a system that is actually working exactly as it was legally and financially designed to work for the defense contractors, generating massive, reliable quarterly profits, but is completely and utterly useless as a mechanism for achieving actual strategic control in the real world?
Well, the mechanics of the system strongly suggest the latter. As a profit-generating enterprise, the U.S. defense industry functions flawlessly. But as a dynamic, adaptable tool for neutralizing an asymmetrical threat, it failed spectacularly.
Spectacularly.
And historically, when military mathematics fail this glaringly on the battlefield, political leadership scrambles to find a diplomatic exit ramp before the structural collapse becomes obvious to the public. But as the diplomatic timeline of this conflict reveals, by the time the politicians fully grasped the severity of the actuarial and mathematical trap they were in, the exit doors were already welded shut.
The diplomatic flailing that occurs around week 3 of the conflict is agonizing to analyze. The U.S. is bleeding interceptors. The Strait of Hormuz is functionally closed to commercial traffic. Global supply chains are violently seizing up. The price of energy is suffocating the global economy. And the U.S. political leadership resorts to the only tool they have left, which is performative escalation.
Yeah.
And we see in sources, President Trump publicly threatens to systematically bomb Iran's remaining energy infrastructure unless the swarm immediately ceases operations and reopens the strait.
Right, and in a traditional state-on-state conflict, a threat to annihilate a nation's core economic engine forces them to the negotiating table. But what was the swarm's response?
Total silence. They don't even flinch. They completely call the bluff because they know the U.S. cannot physically afford to escalate a war of attrition. So the U.S. administration immediately pivots. They try to manufacture an off-ramp. The White House suddenly leaks claims to the press that highly productive back-channel diplomatic talks are occurring, implying a ceasefire is imminent.
And the Iranian Revolutionary Guard immediately and very publicly torches that narrative. They issue a blunt public denial to the global press saying there are no talks. The Americans are lying.
The U.S. unilaterally announces a 5-day pause on all offensive strikes, hoping to de-escalate. The global markets gasp for air, the algorithms see the headline, and oil futures drop for about 12 hours. But on the ground, in the mountains overlooking Hormuz, absolutely nothing changes. The drones just keep launching.
By week 4, the political transition inside Iran solidifies the new reality. The assassinated supreme leader's son officially takes the helm, but the actual operational control is entirely consolidated within the decentralized ranks of the Revolutionary Guard.
So the swarm is running the show.
Exactly. And their strategic messaging to the globe remains chillingly consistent. The strait remains uninsurable. The economic blockade continues. Every drop of blood from the decapitation strike will be answered in economic attrition.
This is where we see the jaws of the trap fully snap shut on American power projection. The analysis lays out 2 potential paths forward for the United States at this juncture, and both lead to catastrophic strategic defeat. Let's examine option A, where the U.S. decides the juice just isn't worth the squeeze, declares victory based on the initial 900 strikes, and simply walks away.
Well, if the U.S. withdraws, the geopolitical consequences are terminal. The Gulf states, who relied entirely on the myth of American military invincibility to protect their wealth, lose faith in U.S. security guarantees forever.
The illusion is broken.
Exactly. The entire petrodollar system, that massive recycling of wealth that underpins the value of the U.S. dollar and funds the American deficit, begins to fracture as those states seek security alignments with China or Russia. The American empire essentially has to stand naked in front of the global community and admit that its military supremacy was, when pushed to the absolute limit, an unsustainable bluff.
So option A triggers a systemic collapse of American global financial influence. Now let's look at option B, where the U.S. doubles down and commits to the fight.
If they stay, they're committing to an unwinnable war of mathematical attrition. They continue to bleed hundreds of millions of dollars every single day, firing depleted stocks of Patriot missiles at $50,000 drones. The military-industrial base fails to resupply them.
Because they just can't build them fast enough.
Right. Meanwhile, the Strait of Hormuz remains economically closed, The risk premiums remain toxic, and the entire global economy slowly asphyxiates from energy starvation.
It is the ultimate, inescapable no-win scenario. And it vividly reiterates the core revelation of this entire analysis. You can execute your conventional playbook perfectly. You can achieve total kinetic dominance in the opening phase. You can destroy 900 targets in 5 days. You can win every single tactical engagement on the board. And you can still comprehensively lose the war if your enemy simply refuses to accept the biological metaphor of defeat you've projected onto them.
There's a profound historical observation from the sources that encapsulates the vulnerability of the American position here. It says, an empire founded on war has to maintain itself by war. And that works perfectly, right up until the fundamental mathematics of warfare permanently turn against you.
The math flipped. And it forces us to entirely dismantle and rebuild what the concept of victory actually means in the 21st century. Victory is no longer defined by who possesses the largest aircraft carriers, who controls the high-altitude airspace, or who can drop the most precision tonnage.
No, it's not about that anymore.
Victory is now defined by economic endurance. It's about resilience. It's about who can sustain the agonizing cost of the conflict longer. In this specific crucible, the cheap, decentralized swarm mathematically outlasted the expensive, centralized fortress.
It's a fundamental shift in how power operates.
Let's take a breath and re-examine the incredibly dense territory we just navigated. We started by peeling back the deceptive success of a massive, overwhelming 900-strike military operation. We dismantled the fatal systemic misunderstanding of the decapitation doctrine, exploring how assassinating a leader who culturally and theologically desired martyrdom didn't sever the head of the snake. It poured high-octane gasoline onto an ideological fire.
We tracked how the Iranian military weaponized its own destruction, decentralizing into highly autonomous, self-sustaining swarm cells. We analyzed the sociological catastrophe of the U.S. targeting strategy, how dropping high explosives on progressive urban centers like Tehran effectively eradicated the very demographics most likely to support internal regime change while leaving the rural hardliners completely untouched.
We explored the weaponization of geography and the total deconstruction of diplomatic neutrality. We saw how the swarm targeted the invisible financial scaffolding of the Gulf, exposing the inherent psychological fragility of expat-reliant engineering marvels like Dubai.
Right, the cruise ship analogy.
We learned how the physical topography of the Strait of Hormuz allowed Iran to trigger an actuarial war, utilizing marine insurance syndicates in London to freeze global shipping and starve the desert Gulf states of vital survival imports.
And finally, we broke down the apocalyptic math of asymmetric warfare. The $50,000 two-stroke drone neutralizing the $4 million algorithmically blind Patriot missile. We examined how the Cold War-era incentive structures of defense contracting built a military optimized for generating corporate profit through extreme complexity, leaving it entirely trapped in an unwinnable economic equation against a swarm.
It is a sobering masterclass in the yawning chasm between conventional military might and actual strategic reality. But before we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final, highly provocative thought to wrestle with long after this deep dive ends. This isn't explicitly detailed in the tactical postmortems we analyzed today, but it is the terrifying, logical next question.
Okay, let's hear it.
If the absolute pinnacle of conventional military power, the United States operating with the full weight of its carrier strike groups abroad, can be comprehensively economically neutralized by flatbed trucks, fiberglass drones, and the risk tables of commercial insurance premiums, what does this paradigm shift mean for the future of domestic security?
Oh, wow. That is an incredibly chilling implication to extrapolate.
Right. If the foundational mathematics of warfare have permanently flipped to favor cheap, decentralized swarms over massively expensive, centralized fortresses, how will any global superpower protect its own critical infrastructure at home in the coming decades?
It's a huge vulnerability.
If a $20,000 flying lawnmower can shut down a global oil choke point 7,000 miles away, what happens when localized swarms of them are autonomously deployed against domestic power grids in the Midwest, water treatment facilities in California, or critical transit hubs in New York? The algorithms won't see them coming. The interceptors are too expensive to use. Will defending our own cities against the mathematics of the swarm become the next great actuarial nightmare? It's a reality we are all going to have to confront.
The rules of the geopolitical game haven't just shifted, they have been fundamentally rewritten. And deeply understanding the brutal, asymmetrical math behind those new rules is really the only viable way to anticipate what comes next.
I want to thank you for bringing such surgical, clarifying analysis to these incredibly dense strategic mechanisms today. And I want to thank you, the listener, for taking this deep dive with us. Keep interrogating the surface level narratives you're handed. Remember the ultimate lesson of February 2026. The military force that confidently claims a flawless 100% success rate on the battlefield, well, that might just be the military that lacks the operational awareness to realize it has already lost the war. We'll see you next time.
If you enjoyed this, please remember to like this video,
Share it with your friends and subscribe to our channel.